All right, Alexander, we have got to talk about the news that the Russian Tsar Nicholas is going to be implementing a parliament. From what I understand, it's going to be a Duma. And this is an interesting proposal. And from what I understand, this Duma that he has proposed and is actually implementing is could threaten his. I mean, from my point of view, could threaten his monarchy. But I guess he's trying to bring in. Would you say some sort of more of a Western type of governance, or what's the reason for putting this Duma in place? Because um, we haven't seen this type of governing in Russia, in the Russian Empire, at all. So this is very new for the Russian people as well.
Absolutely. Now, I think the first thing to understand is that Nicholas himself is always written about as a profoundly reactionary figure, somebody who wants to adhere to the autocracy, who believes in one person rule, who is deeply hostile to any involvement of outside people in the government. And I've never thought that is true. And I think, in fact, what we've just seen with this manifesto, which he's published in October, the October Manifesto, as it's already been called, is the fact that this isn't true at all. Now, at the moment, the political situation in Russia is quite stable. There was a big protest in January in St. Petersburg, which was dispersed by the military. Hundreds of people were killed. It was very badly managed. This is an event which is often referred to as Bloody Sunday. Nicholas himself wasn't involved. He wasn't in St. Petersburg at the time that it happened. It was mismanaged by the local security forces. And that has created some degree of tension. But overall, the situation in the country is stable. There's been a difficult war with Japan, but again, contrary to what most people read about in the West, where there's great hostility to Nicholas, this war has ended in a stalemate. There's been a negotiated agreement with the Japanese, which has left things basically as they were before the war. If you look at what the Japanese were trying to achieve, they didn't achieve all their objectives. And now he's moved forward with this proposal to set up a Duma, which is a parliament. Now, this isn't something that Russia has ever had. It's been talked about many times. His father resolutely opposed it. His grandfather, Nicholas I, also resolutely opposed it. But to many people's surprise, he's actually done it. And he's given a very, very wide suffrage. He's given essentially universal suffrage so that Russians will be able for the first time to vote for a parliament. And as I said, it's not the case that he's been forced into it, but he has done it. Now, I think the challenge he faces is twofold. Firstly, there are people on the right, obviously, who don't want him to move ahead with constitutional reform because they feel that this is destabilizing. But his much bigger challenge now is from the liberals and from the middle class movement that supports the liberals, because they have, for the last decades, created a culture of profound opposition to the government and to the Tsar. And now they have been given, in effect, what they've been agitating for. They've been given a parliament. If they go into this parliament in a constructive mood and decide to support the government, and in a constructive way, but also to oppose it also in a constructive way, then Parliament will be able to move forward and work alongside the government and work alongside the government successfully. And we could start to see a stabilising situation in the country, and the country moving forward towards a political system, a parliamentary constitutional system, bringing the two elements of the of the political system, the monarchy, the parliament, into harmony. But if the liberals, who are expected to do well in the forthcoming elections, continue this policy of implacable opposition to the Tsar and his government, and continue their policy of projecting him as this reactionary, bigoted figure, then I'm afraid there's a very real risk that what we're going to get instead is paralysis and dysfunction and a situation where neither part of the political system is able to work properly, in which case, I'm afraid, given the fact that Russia is going through a major transition period, it's industrializing, it's changing in many different ways, education is spreading throughout the population. If things aren't worked out properly, if there is opposition, if you like, for the sake of opposition, then we could see a deepening crisis.
What exactly are the liberals looking for? How would they like the country to be governed?
Well, this is a very good question, actually, and one does actually wonder. One gets the sense sometimes that with the Liberals, they talk a lot about, having a parliament, having a constitution, having a rule of law. Russia actually has a very well-established legal code, and there have been very extensive legal reforms carried out over many years. And most people would accept, actually, that today's Russia has a legal culture which is comparable in some ways to what you would find in many European countries. Anyway, the Liberals always say that they want those things, but it never seems to be enough. And one gets the sense that what they really want is not to have constitutions and governments and those things, but to be the government themselves, to be the actual people in overall charge. And they come to this with the implacable conviction that they are somehow entitled to lead Russia, despite the fact that they are almost certainly representative of only a small fraction of the Russian population, but also that they have a very grandiose projects to reconstruct and refashion Russian society in ways which I suspect most Russians don't agree with. And, they have, dare I say, utopian projects which would probably end very badly for them if they persisted with them. And, the government, various people, and mustn't make the assumption that everybody in the Russian government is a reactionary. The Russian government, I think, has been trying to explain to these people that, we're not talking about Western Europe, we're talking about Russia. And besides, even in Western Europe, many of these projects that the Liberals have are really unachievable, or at least unachievable in any time soon, and that they don't have the level of political support in society that the Liberals appear to think they do, and that the Liberals themselves, who have no experience of government, are not the right people to run the government anyway, especially in a complex society like Russia. So I think they've been trying to explain that to the Liberals, but I get the impression that many Liberals find that very difficult to accept indeed. And on the contrary, as I said, they really think that they should be in power, that any situation in which they are not in power is somehow an illegitimate one, and that they are prepared, in effect, or at least some of them are, to oppose anybody who stands in the way of them being in power, and by definition, that they're prepared to use any tool that lies at their disposal to make them achieving power possible. So, it's not inconceivable that we could see an escalating crisis if this group of people manage to win support in the Duma and make it very difficult, as I said, for the government to function. I think there is goodwill from the government. I think there is a genuine desire on the part of the Tsar himself to work with these people. The big question is whether they are prepared to work with him, because, as I said, I'm not convinced that they feel that any political system which isn't run by them is a legitimate one.
Do you think the Tsar understands this? Who's consulting the Tsar? Who are his most trusted consultants? I mean, I know that, for example, the Tsarina is very much devoted to the Tsar, and she seems that she's more dubious about what's going on. And so you have the family, which is a strong foundation for the Tsar. But is he understanding the threat that the liberals may pose to him? It may, because we're going to see everything unfold. But does he understand this? Does he have people close to him who are consulting with him as he's going forward in this venture? Because it appears to me that at this time period, we're about to enter very unstable times. Storms are rising in Europe. I mean, in Western Europe is not all it's cracked up to be. So how are you reading the situation?
Well, first of all, let's talk about the people who are advising the Tsar. He does speak with his wife, and it's fairly well known that she has a much more sceptical idea or feelings about these reforms than he does. Bear in mind, of course, that she comes from outside. She's of German nationality, brought up in England, by the way, in the court of Queen Victoria. There's been many people who say that she doesn't understand Russian realities very well, and she has problems also that parts of the Tsar's family apparently don't like her very much, especially the Tsar's mother. And that is, by the way, a complicating factor because she's German. The Empress herself is German, whereas the Tsar's mother is Danish, and Denmark has a hostility towards Germany. And of course, we're in a situation where relations between Germany and Russia are absolutely fundamental to maintaining European peace. The fact that the Tsar's mother is known to be very hostile to Germany and to everything German, and to be running a feud against the Tsar's German wife is obviously a major complicating factor. But all right, let's put aside the problems within the imperial family itself, which are very difficult to gauge, and there's many different people in the imperial family, some of them incredibly educated, highly intelligent people. One of them, the Tsar's cousin, Grand Prince Constantine, for example, is an extremely accomplished poet. And so, I mean, we're talking about a complicated group of an interesting group of people. But within the government itself, and this is another problem, there are divisions. So the most powerful political figure in Russia for many years has been Sergei Witte, who was the finance minister for a long time. He was the person who was in overall charge of economic policy. He runs the country's industrialization program. He is believed to be somebody who is amenable to working with the liberals, provided, of course, they're prepared to work with him. He's not perhaps somebody, however, who is fully trusted by other members of the government. There are people like Duran, who is the former interior minister, who is known to be hostile to reforms and believes that the liberals are simply people that you can't trust in any shape or form. And he takes the view that this experiment of trying to work with the liberals is a hopeless one and is going to end incredibly badly. But over and above and beyond that, there is the military, if you like, the deep state in Russia, which is incredibly powerful. I mean, Russia has an enormous deep state. It has vast intelligence, security, military apparatus. It's got a very large military industrial complex. Now, they are known to be very keen to work with the liberals. And in fact, there is a great deal of intermingling between some elements of the deep state, particularly the economic departments and the liberals, and especially industrialists and, if you like, Russian oligarchs who support the liberals. And the idea that many of the people in the deep state have is that they have essentially, I think, to some extent, bought into this idea that the liberals are the people who actually have the knowledge and the expertise to govern Russia, something which I don't myself, by the way, a view I don't personally share, but they're also the people who can stabilize the situation and who have the ability, if you like, to pursue legitimate policies. And it's fairly well known that this sort of deep state grouping and the liberal parties, as I said, they have a lot of contact with each other, and they are prepared, they undoubtedly are to a great extent pushing for these reforms, for these political changes. And Nicholas, who always has to be very careful what the deep state says, is known to be somebody who listens very carefully to its advice and who tends to follow it. He does so even when some people, like, as I said, Duran, think that it would be unwise for him to do so. So he's got to balance these different political forces and try to work with them. Overall, the military-industrial complex, if you like, the deep state, if you prefer, they want to see these reforms implemented. There are other people within the court, within the perhaps the security services, which are more charged with maintaining control, which are more sceptical about this idea. But even they, it must be said, are divided. And I should say that within the security services in Russia, there's also a particular grouping who feel that what the Tsar ought to be doing is forgetting about the liberals, forgetting about the middle class. We're trying instead to forge a coalition, if you like, with industrial workers and with the larger population, because they are more interested in, people like that are more interested in economic changes and economic welfare programs and those sort of things. They're not so interested in the kind of agendas that the liberals want to follow. And if you're talking about the wider working class population, they tend to see the liberals as, the oligarchs who basically control Russian society, control the media, for example, control information, and at the same time are the people who are pushing down very hard on them as they try to forge ahead with the industrialization program. So you have this tension within the circle at the moment around the Tsar and amongst his advisors. But he's for the moment opted to go with those who think that he should reach out for the liberals, set up this parliament, try to work with the liberals, see where they can be assimilated into the political system, and whether or not this can all work. We will see which faction within the government is correct and how the liberals respond to this opportunity that they've been given. If they reach out for more, then we could see very profound destabilization over the next few weeks and months.
Yeah, it's okay. It seems that there is a lot of change in the domestic affairs of Russia, and the Tsar is really undertaking a lot of big structural changes within the way Russian society and Russian government operates. But Alexander, have you been following what's going on in foreign policy outside of Russia with regards to Russia? I know that Nicholas has come to some sort of an agreement with the United Kingdom. I believe it's the Anglo-Russian Convention that they're working out on piecing together. There was a lot of disputes over long-standing disputes, specifically in Central Asia, and it looks like they're going to clear those up. And you're starting to see the formation of an alliance: Russia, France, the United Kingdom, but you also see the expansion of the Austro-Hungarian Empire as well, especially with regards to the Balkans. What do you see going on there?
Right.
Does this worry you? Does this concern you?
Yeah. Now, I think if we talk about Russia, the Russians have a very straightforward policy about Europe. They want peace in Europe. As far as they're concerned, they have this very difficult transition to work through. They've obviously had major complications of their relations with the Far East, with Japan. The war has not been an easy one. As I said, it's ended in an effective stalemate situation, not what you read about in the West. But from their point of view, they've got all kinds of problems. They're trying to carry out major structural reforms within Russia itself, these constitutional reforms that we've talked about. They're at the beginning of an industrialization process, which is expected to be extremely complicated. They want peace and stability in Europe. And what the Russians have been trying to do is they've been trying to keep the two various parts of the European divide, which basically are Germany and Austria on the one side, Britain and France on the other. They've been trying to maintain a balance between the two. It complicates matters further that there is a family dimension to this, in that the Tsar is related to both the British and German royal families. So he's got this particular issue to work out also. It's widely believed that he's fundamentally more sympathetic to the British royal family than the German, but he's always managed to keep open his links to the Germans as well. So they want to keep a balance. Now, back in the 1890s, France and Russia formed what was in effect an alliance. Now, the Russians didn't see that as an attempt to isolate Germany. They saw that as a mechanism for actually maintaining stability in Europe, because they were worried that Germany was becoming very powerful and that France was rather weak. The idea was that by getting France and Russia to ally, that would stabilize the situation in Europe. And in fact, what you saw was that the Russians went out of their way afterwards to try to improve relations with Germany. And in fact, over the last decade or so, up to and including the recent war with Japan, relations between Germany and Russia have been actually quite good. Now, the problem is that we've just had this war and we have this festering crisis. Now, over the course of the war, the Tsar and the German Emperor met, and they seemed to come to an agreement that the Germans and the Russians would try and work together further to try to stabilize the situation in Europe. The French reacted very negatively against this agreement, so did the British, and the agreement had to be scrapped, and that's been, I think, extremely disappointing for the Tsar, and it cuts against his policy. And the result is that his relations with Germany have been disrupted, even though he wants to preserve them. And he is being pushed into a situation where, instead of maintaining the balance between the great powers, which is what I think Russia would always like to prefer, he is being forced to tilt further in favor of one against the other. So he is tilting more towards the French and the British at the moment than he is towards the Germans. And a complicating factor is that within Germany, there is a very hard line, very radical grouping that's starting to emerge, which is talking increasingly about Germany having some kind of destiny, a policy of Weltpolitik, world policy, about Germany being the country that somehow embodies the future, that has all the ideas that will represent the future. And of course, that is very disruptive, because it means that the Germans, from a Russian point of view, are starting to take increasingly wild and reckless positions on foreign policy, and are starting to look for conflicts in all kinds of places around the world where they should be instead seeking to avoid them. And I think that the fact that the Russians are not able to preserve the kind of contacts with the Germans that they had previously, I think that is worrying them. So from a Russian point of view, at least from the point of view of the government, I think they are looking at a situation in Europe which is becoming increasingly unsatisfactory. As I said, Germany has all kinds of ideas. There's all sorts of people circulating there, people with very radical ideas about Germany's role in the world, who think that it is an exceptional country and should pursue exceptionist foreign policies. And at the same time, it's a country which the Russian attempt to preserve good relations with is beginning to become disrupted. They see the Germans giving increasing backing to the Austrians, who are now pushing hard. As a result, they're using the fact that they got all this German backing to push increasingly hard in the Balkans and other places in a way that the Russians would prefer not to see. And at the same time, the Russians find that without really wanting to, they're being drawn into an alliance with the British and the French, which at the moment is, again, not their preferred choice, but which they feel they have no real alternative to, given the realities, the power realities at the moment, the global power realities, and of course the European ones.
What's What's the relationship between the Tsar and the Balkans? Do you think the Balkans are a red line for the Tsar?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's clearly indicated, for example, the Russians have clearly. I mean, you only have to read Russian newspapers to see that Serbia, for example, and the situation, anything to do with Serbia, is for the Russians an incredibly sensitive issue. I mean, I think again, this isn't widely understood or appreciated in Europe. But if there was an attack on Serbia, for example, from Austria, which at the moment doesn't look very likely, but there are some people in Austria who talk sometimes as if that might happen. If there was an attack on Serbia, then Russia would be obliged to fight for it because it is an extremely sensitive issue. I mean, the Russians have enormously close connections with Serbia. With Montenegro as well, by the way, with all the various, with those particular with those Slav countries or Slav Orthodox countries in the Balkans. I mean, no Russian government could sacrifice them. Even the liberals, I suspect, would find themselves under enormous challenge if they were in power and there was a crisis in the Balkans. I don't know whether this is fully understood in Vienna or Berlin.
Right. Do you fear that that would draw in the UK? Would the UK or France be drawn into something happening in the Balkans?
At the moment, nobody can say. It depends how much they value their alliance with Russia. I think that the British and the French at the moment would prefer not to go to war over an issue in the Balkans. But if there was a war, if there was a real prospect of a war between Russia and the Germans, over the Balkans, then I don't really see how the British, or at least certainly not the French, would be able to stay out of it.
All right, Alexander, let's move back to Russia and some domestic issues. And I don't want to gossip too much on this program, but there are reports that something's not well within the Tsar's family. And specifically, it has to do with the birth and the health of Alexei, who would be the heir to the throne, correct? I mean, that is the one and only son to Nicholas. But do you know what's going on there? Do you know do you have any information as to what might be happening with Alexei? I've heard rumors of doctors. I've heard rumors of mystics. What do you see happening here?
About the Tsarevich, the Crown Prince, absolutely. You know, he is in line now to be the next Tsar. He's going to be the next Tsar. And there are indeed some rumours, they're not very well corroborated, that all is not entirely well with him. I mean, he's only a year old. And of course, children can go through periods of ill health, we're obviously not told very much about what they are. But that there are rumours about this, that's indisputable. But beyond that and above that, there is also with the Empress always the problem that, yes, she does bring in doctors and all sorts of people like this to look after her family. She's known to be very careful about looking after her children. But she's also somebody who, as I've discussed, has a difficult relationship with her mother-in-law, the emperor, the Tsar's mother, and with other members of the imperial court. And this has meant that her natural shyness has been exacerbated, and she seems to have become increasingly isolated. And there are reports that she has become, as a result, more prone to seeking advice from various people with mystical views and ideas than perhaps would be entirely welcomed within the imperial court. Now, we don't know very much about this at the moment, and there's been some names mentioned. There's been references to somebody called Monsieur Philippe, for example, who's some kind of mystic from Europe who seems to be apparently quite close to her. There's not very much information about this. And so far, I have to say, it doesn't seem to have impacted very much on the Tsar's political decisions. But given how centralized the political system in Russia is around the person of the Tsar, obviously, if there's problems in his family, either with his son or with his wife, or other things, then of course that adds another layer of complication to the decisions he has to make, which I suspect would be deeply unwelcome.
Is the Tsarina religious? Is she Orthodox? Just out of curiosity.
Deeply religious. She's known to be deeply religious. She's one of these people. She was very, very religious when she was a Protestant in Germany and England, and then she converted to Orthodoxy. And like a lot of people who convert to a new faith, she's embraced it with an intense fervour. More, I think, than is popular within the court. The attitude within the Russian aristocracy at the moment is to be, to take your religion in a fairly relaxed way. I think this passionate embrace of religion is something that some Russians within the court and, of course, within broader society find rather difficult because, of course, it perhaps to those of them who are shall we say, more distant from their faith. It's a reminder of the extent to which they have become more distant from their faith. And of course, to those who entirely reject religion completely, and there's an increasing number of those, then having a religious person close to the Tsar, a person who embraces religion in that kind of way, well, that's of course something that they find objectionable. So she is extremely religious, and as I said, that isn't looked upon with favour across the whole of Russian society.
Yeah, I would definitely say that a lot of the, I guess for lack of a better word, you would call them the elite society of Russia has definitely moved away from a religious belief. I mean, that's...
Oh, absolutely. Entirely so. And I would add something else, by the way. I mean, not only do these people, in many cases, not profess religion anymore, but of course, Russia, if you go to Russia, if you went to St. Petersburg today or Moscow, I mean, it's the most... it's become the most hedonistic place in Europe. I mean, you talk about wild parties and esoteric practices and cults and all sorts of, frankly, behaviour which I personally would disapprove of completely. But that's my own personal feelings. But I think that some of it is frankly straightforward criminal behaviour. I mean, this goes on in St. Petersburg now to an extent that you will not find anywhere else in Europe. And, Russia is, I'm afraid, at the epicenter of this. And, we talked about, the political conflicts. Of course, many of the people who are involved in the political conflicts most fervently, and indeed, by the way, some people on the liberal side of politics, are the most intense practitioners of this sort of thing. The liberal movement in Russia, for example, is riddled with Masonic groups, as is universally known. I mean, that's not a theory. That is a fact. And, there's Masonic groups which are very respectable and very, behave very great propriety, though I should say Freemasonry is against the law in Russia, but nonetheless, they're very respectable Masonic groups. But then there are some which are not, and which go all the way into occultism. And of course, some of them are just basically political groupings. And it's not just occultism, but there's all sorts of other things going on in Russia, which are an extreme version. If you want to get some idea of how bizarre things can be in Russia, go to the music of a Russian composer, Alexander Scriabin, who writes some very, very weird music. I mean, with he has sonatas like Black Mass and White Mass and all these sort of things, which have some very, very bizarre ideas and strange ideas. And of course, as I said, a lot of it, to be straightforward about it, can be very orgiastic and all this. So Alexandra, the Empress, coming into all of this from this kind of world. It's not surprising, with her deep religious beliefs and her passionate embrace of orthodoxy, that this isn't looked upon with great favour by many people.
Yeah, it's kind of like the hedonistic practices that are taking place in various apartments and living quarters in St. Petersburg is like the worst kept secret, I think, at this point in time among the elites and the bourgeois political class. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, you go to St. Petersburg. I mean, there's even a place, the people point it out to you, called the Tower, which is an apartment building with a sort of copper dome, and it's got glass things, and all sorts of intellectuals and poets meet there, and apparently all sorts of funny things go on. And that's just one place. Remember, Theosophy, this very strange religious, if it is religious, pseudo-religious movement, developed in Russia. People like Madame Blavatsky, and she, by the way, is a relative moderate. In fact, she's very much a moderate compared to some of the other things that go on.
We'll continue to follow these developments very closely. Go to theduran.locals.com, everybody, and go to the Duran shop, 10% off when you use the code REALNEWS. Take care.